Good morning. So grateful that you all have chosen to come and listen to and learn more about what it means to grow younger. And we want to share a little bit more in depth about what the research is telling us and how it might affect and impact this church as you guys reach out and want to care for the young people, not only in this church, but also in our community, in the community of Mount Holly and beyond. So thank you for taking the time and willingness for you to come and be a part of this. My name's Andy Jung. I am the Director of Church Engagement at Fuller Youth Institute. Fuller Youth Institute is a research center and part of Fuller Seminary out in Pasadena, California. And what we do at Fuller Youth Institute is to do research primarily on young people, youth and young adults. And we turn that research into resources and training that benefit the church. And so we work with churches all across the country and really around the world. We do trainings, we've done trainings and currently doing trainings in Australia and Scotland and so many other places. And so this research has really impacted the global church as much as it has here in the United States. But the research that we've done is based here in the U.S. And it's based all across the country. It's not just coming out of Southern California, because I know what many of you are thinking, because I've lived here in North Carolina most of my life also. But I want to share a little bit about growing young and just kind of give you an overview of this. And I know that some of you, a small group of you guys, have been studying this and going deeper with this, and hopefully it'll kind of give rest of you a little bit of an overview. And so we always want to start with this question: what does the future of your church look like? At Fuller Youth Institute, we believe that young people are really the present and the future. They're present. They're not the future leaders of the church. They will be. But we really believe that they are current leaders, and they can help lead the congregation today. And so we really believe that this sanctuary, that this church sitting right here in Mount Holly, can be a church that is filled with young people. Now, when I say young people, what do I mean? I mean youth and young adults and children and young families. We're talking about our research specifically is from ages 15 to 29. But I would expand that to children's age all the way through really early to mid-30s. We will consider them young people, and I'll tell you a little bit about why rest of this morning. But we really believe that this sanctuary can be filled with young people and young families. We really believe that there are young people out there in the community that need and want to be a part and be included into a church family just like this one. And we're excited that you guys are thinking and hoping for that also. In our research, we heard this quote, which is not what we want to hear from our young people, saying that the only time that they really think about God is when I'm at church. We really want church to be a place, not only a place, but also something that they experience on a daily life. Right? It isn't something that they just come to on a Sunday morning, and that's the only time that they experience God. Max Dupree was a former trustee of Fuller Seminary and a well-known business leader, and he would always say that the first job of a leader is to define reality. And so I want to take a few moments to define reality of what's happening in our country and in our culture today. when it comes to church and faith. What we know from our research is that, unfortunately, 1 out of every 2 young people who graduate from a church just like this one. My guess is just a few Sundays ago, you guys had a graduation recognition service right here, right? Where your graduates of high schoolers walked across this stage. You guys celebrated them and congratulated them, which you should have. You should have done those things, right? And you want to help them to know that they are seen and recognized and celebrated. Unfortunately, what we know is that 1 out of every 2 of those will drift away from God within the next 12 to 18 months. At least that's what statistics will tell us, and our studies will tell us, is that 1 out of 2, these aren't just students that are not in church or just barely connected to the church. We're talking about students that are grown up in church or have participated in church or in youth ministry, and yet 1 out of 2 will drift away from God within the next 12 to 18 months. I don't know about you, but that isn't good enough for me, and it shouldn't be good enough for you in the church also. Not only will they begin to drift away from God within the first 12 to 18 months, but give them a little bit more time, and we see a few more drift away. So 2 out of every 3 will drift away from the church and away from their faith between the ages of 18 to 23. And this statistic or this slide shouldn't surprise you that most Christian tradition in the United States are either barely maintaining or primarily shrinking or declining over just numerically. And so both Cooperative Baptist Fellowship numbers are declining, and Southern Baptist Convention's numbers are also declining. And you'll see that most of the denominations across the country are experiencing the same thing. Assemblies of God may be the only one that's really kind of holding steady, but they're certainly not growing at all. The share of U.S. adults who identify as Christians has continued to decrease over the last 10 or 15 years. This statistic is from 2019. From 2009 to 2019, that number has decreased 12%. 12%. Those that would profess to be Christ followers in the U.S. Declined in 10-year span. Okay, 10 years isn't a long time, right? But within just a 10-year span, we know that 12% of decrease happened. Which shouldn't surprise you with this next statistic, is that the share of U.S. adults who are religiously unaffiliated continues to increase. We call, in the research world, we call these the nones, not our Catholic sisters, but our nones, N-O-N-E-S, those who profess no faith at all. And so those who are unaffiliated, you see the increase, 17 to 26%, an increase of 9%. Actually, in the 2021 statistic that came out, that number is now 31%. 31% who would consider themselves to be nones, those who do not profess any type of affiliation to religion. So it's no surprise then is that decreased affiliation also equals to decreased attendance, right? We can look around and see that in most churches. And so what we also know is that this is a generational thing that's happening, all right? For our oldest generation, the silent generation, over about 83 or 84% of them would profess to be Christ followers, or would check off that they're Christians. Okay, 84%. The boomers, boomers are also high in numbers, but just you can see that there's a slight decline in that, and that number drops down to about 76% or so. So 3 out of every 4 boomers would also profess to be Christians. We'll skip the Gen Xers because that's my group, and I don't like talking about my group, but we will blame it all on the millennials because they get blamed on everything. But the millennials are down to 49%. 49% of millennials would profess to be Christ followers. Now, let's define millennials, because again, we tend to, in culture, we tend to blame just about everything on this millennial group. And so our millennials, believe it or not, have reached their lower 40s. So millennials are generally from somewhere between currently 23 or 24 all the way up to 42. Is that millennial generation that we hear so much about. So 24 to 42. The next generation that you're starting to hear a little bit more about is the Gen Z generation. Gen Z generation is ages somewhere, depending on who you read, somewhere between the ages of 5 to 20 or early 20s. So our current elementary school kids, our high school, middle school and high school, and generally our college students, undergrad students, are your Gen Zers. I don't know who decided that we would start with Gen X as a letter of following or naming generations, but the earliest generations, or our youngest generation, is now, we ran out of letters, so we're going to have to go to Greek letters. They're the Generation Alpha. Okay, they're Gen Alpha, and they're from birth through age 5 now. So that gives you a little bit of context of who our generations are. Those who are in the age group of 18 to 29-year-olds, they make up about 17% of our U.S. population, but yet they only make up about 10% of our church population. Many of them are not in church. All those kind of numbers align with one another. Scott Kermode, who's a leadership professor at Fuller Seminary, would say this, that the church is calibrated for a world that doesn't exist. Church is calibrated for a world that doesn't exist any longer. But again, at Fuller Youth Institute, we don't want to dwell on the negative statistics too long. We really do believe that it can be different. And our mission is to help churches to be different than what we are experiencing today. So Growing Young was born out of our study that started with Sticky Faith. Sticky Faith was our first original study. We tracked high school graduates who went off to college, and we tracked their faith engagement for a period of time. And again, what we found was that 1 out of every 2 of these young people, again, these are Christian young people who spent a lot of time in church. They were nominated by their youth pastors or their pastors. And we would track them, and again, 1 out of every 2 would drift away from their faith. And so we began to ask questions of, well, why is that happening? Or how do we help that to be a better statistic than 1 out of every 2? And we began to think about what system is at play, and of course, church is one of those systems that's at play here. And so we began to look at, well, what does it really take for churches like First Mount Holly to be a church that not only loves and cares for young people, but then retains those young people within the church. And so we began to study churches all across the country that were doing this well, that were reaching and retaining young people well. And so we studied hundreds of churches, hundreds of hours of assessments and phone calls and conversations. And what we were looking for are what were the characteristics that churches needed in order to reach and care for young people well and ultimately retain them in the church. What were the characteristics? So, definition of a growing young church from our research is this, that churches that aren't shrinking and aging, but are growing in involving and retaining young people. Again, our research was from the age group of 15 to 29, which brings overall vitality to the whole church. We entered into this study thinking, well, what was it that the churches were doing to impact young people? And certainly we saw those characteristics kind of rise to the top. But what we didn't, we should have, but what we didn't necessarily look for at the beginning was how the young people really impacted the church family also. And that's why that word vitality is in green here, is that we saw that young people who are engaged and involved in the whole church brought vitality to the whole congregation, that they gave as much as they were receiving in their faith journey, which makes total sense. So here's that $1 million question, right? What does it really take to reach young people today? And so what we want to make sure that everyone realizes is that Growing Young isn't a program that you just open up a box and you do a few things and voila, magically young people start walking into the church. If someone tells you that they know how to do that, you need to probably run. And so what we know from our research is that these are qualities that you don't necessarily have to have, which is kind of what we think we need for churches to grow younger. It doesn't matter the size or the location. It doesn't matter how old the church has been here or how long the church has been standing right here. Or it doesn't matter the denomination. So our thought is, hey, we gotta, young people just want to go to those non-denominational churches. Or young people just want to go to X, Y, and Z churches. And that's not what we saw in terms of really understanding why young people are engaged in church. Growing Young isn't about changing youth ministry. It really is about focusing on the culture of the church. What is it about the whole church that young people are drawn to and seek out? And so it isn't about doing youth ministry better. I mean, we certainly believe that youth ministry can be done better, but we also know that it's about the whole church and not just a segment of the church. So it isn't just up to Tori to figure this out. It's not just her job to say, all right, Tori, it's your job to bring in all the young people into the church. That's not fair to anyone. But it's the job of the whole church to understand that. I almost didn't put this slide in or took it out because it is the slide of a picture of First Baptist Church of Albemarle. I know that's a sore subject, so I won't go there too far. But no, First Baptist Church of Albemarle is the church that I served from 2014 to 2019. It's a church that I dearly love, and I know that Kendall is doing a wonderful job there, as you might expect. But when I first got to First Baptist Church of Albemarle, it wasn't a, shall we say, energetic and thriving congregation. They had gone through some difficult times. They had gone through some leadership changes. They had some struggles within the community. And so when I arrived in 2014, First Baptist Albemarle was really wounded in a lot of ways. And so they took a chance on a longtime youth pastor, served in churches for 20 years as a youth pastor, and that was my first pastorate at First Baptist Albemarle. And here comes this young, well, not so young anymore, guy, and we just really did what God led us to do. I remember our first Wednesday night. You got to remember, again, 20 years in youth ministry, 11 of those in a fairly large church in Raleigh. And here I am in Albemarle, different setting. And that first Wednesday night, as I'm getting ready for the first Wednesday night to be with my congregation, it was about 40 to 50 folks that had come for our Wednesday night dinner, and then for our Wednesday night Bible study. And the average age was probably in the late 60s or early 70s. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it was just very different setting than I was used to. And I began to ask God, what am I doing here? Why have you called me here for this moment in time? But when God calls, you go, and we got to work. And we began to really look at what it is that First Baptist Albemarle had to offer, and how we can offer that to our young people that's in the church and in the community. And I remember maybe 2.5 years later, I remember one Wednesday night where I was busy getting things ready as people were coming in for the Wednesday night dinner, and I turned around and looked, and I had this moment of, this is what God has called me here to do. What I witnessed that Wednesday night was a few more people, a lot more people that had come on Wednesday night dinner. I saw young families that had come to participate in Wednesday night dinners. I saw young toddlers running around the tables in the fellowship hall, and didn't bother anybody for the young toddlers to do that. I saw a young mother coming in with a baby in her arm and a young toddler in tow. And I saw one of our senior adult ladies get up from her table, stopping her conversation with her friends, and went to the young mother and said, "Here, let me take the baby and the toddler so that you can go through the line and get your food." It was the small things that I saw where we knew that something was shifting, something was changing. And it was the culture of the church. It was the culture in which older members knew the younger members. The younger members trusted the older members. It was a culture in which young people were welcomed into the space. It was a culture in which we cared for each other. And not that that wasn't happening in small pockets before I went to First Baptist Church of Albemarle, but we knew that it was happening more and more during that season. So what we found in our research at Fuller Youth Institute is that as we researched all these churches that were doing this well, we saw 6 characteristics that really floated to the top, and we call those the core commitments. This is what we refer to as the growing young wheel, and you see those 6 characteristics that I'll briefly mention in just a second. But it's really hard to see right now on that screen, but what's in the center is the most important thing, right? The Jesus-centered community. If we're not based in Scripture, and if we're not based in our relationship with Jesus, then what are we doing, right? And so it starts in the center of a Jesus-centered community, a group of followers of Jesus who want to be together. But it also included what's on the outside that's really faint there, and that's the context. It's the context. Context of where you're planted, Mount Holly, downtown, right? What works here may not work at First Baptist Church in Albemarle. What works here may not work and probably wouldn't work in Pasadena, California, right? And what works here may not work in other places, where what works there may not work here. So everything has to be contextualized. Otherwise, again, you'll want this to be a program in a box, and it's not that. It isn't that. So there's 6 core characteristics that we'll quickly mention. One, I'll start at kind of the 1 o'clock hour. That's key chain leadership. What we found is that churches that were growing younger or reaching and retaining young people well shared leadership with young people. Young people want to be part of the whole church, not just a small segment of the church in the youth group. Because here's what we've done in youth ministry, and this is churches all across the country. Back in the 70s is when we began to professionalize youth ministry. Ministers were going into youth ministry as a full-time vocation. And churches were beginning to call youth ministers to their church to care for and to disciple young people. And we did that out of love. And we wanted the very best for our young people, to experience ministry and church in greater ways. We loved our young people so much that we also created space in the church for them, just for them, usually in the attic or the basement of most churches. But we created their own space because we wanted them to feel comfortable of being in church. And we loved them so much that we may even have given them a small portion of the budget and said, hey, go and experience things that you can't experience by yourself. And we loved them so much, we gave them a few adults to make sure that nothing was broken or torn up, right? And that's what we did in youth ministry. And we said, hey, we love you, go and do your thing. But guess what that did? Yeah, it isolated them. It put them on an island. We created silos in church. We began to create silos in youth ministry and children's ministry and senior adult ministry and music ministry. It all became entity of its own. And rarely did it kind of mesh together. And it's no wonder that when young people graduate on that graduation Sunday, that for many of them, it feels like they're graduating from church. Because the only people that they've really gotten to know are the people in the youth group. And now we're telling them, hey, congratulations, you've graduated, you're too old, you can't be a part of the youth group anymore. Where are they going to go now? And that's why they feel so displaced oftentimes. And so one of the things that churches that are reaching young people well do is share leadership within the whole church. Age-appropriate leadership, right? It needs to be all age-appropriate. But young people are capable of doing a lot of things, and a lot of things well, if we just empower them, bring them along, help them to understand and see the bigger picture, give them mentors that they can count on. They can do great things. Empathy today. Second one is empathy. That what we saw in churches that were reaching young people well were that older generations had empathy for younger generations, and younger generations had empathy for older generations. Relationships happened. It was relational. Third thing is that young people want to take Jesus' message seriously. Contrary to popular belief, they don't want to just come and play. They want to come and learn and worship and grow, just like you all. We just got to give them the opportunities to be able to do that. Fourth thing is warm relationships. What happens when the whole church is together? Relationships are being formed. The warmth in the church mattered to young people. What they know, what they can kind of tell from a mile away is when they're not wanted. They can sense that from a mile away. So when a church desires them to be in the space that they are, to be a part of the whole church, they want to be engaged in that. Next one is prioritize everywhere. I'm going to come back to that for just a second. The last one is best neighbors. Young people want to not only be here in the pews, but they also want to be out of the pews, out in the community, making a difference, to living out call of Jesus, to care for others. I want to come back to the prioritize everywhere. This doesn't necessarily mean that we need to cater to young people or we need to just give in to young people, but we do need to prioritize them in some ways. Oftentimes they're not prioritized in a lot of churches, and so we need to put emphasis in young people and young families. We need to ask questions like, well, if we make this decision, whatever that decision might be, how will this impact our young families? If we're planning a church-wide event where we want young people to be a part and young families to be a part, and we place that in a Thursday night during the school year at 7 o'clock, guess what you've just done? You've eliminated most of your young people. They're not going to be here. It used to be where bedtimes were not really so structured, but for young people and young families especially, with young kids, bedtimes are pretty structured these days. Whether we agree with it or not, that's not the argument here. The argument is that if you're asking them to choose whether they're going to be here at church or keep some structure at home, they're going to choose structure at home. Again, it's not about acquiescing all the time, but it's about thinking about our young people and their families and making decisions that's best for all people. One of the things that we run into quite often is this idea that, hey, if we're focused on young people, what about us? What about me? None of you are thinking this, I'm sure. None of you. But some would think, hey, young people don't contribute financially much to this church. Why are we going to prioritize them? None of you are thinking that, but it's natural, right? It's natural to ask, well, if we're giving a bigger slice of the pie over here, then somebody's going to lose out over here, right? But that's not necessarily what we see in churches. What we saw in our research is that when young people are prioritized in appropriate ways, what we saw was that instead of them getting a bigger slice of the pie just got larger for everybody. Again, it's that idea of vitality coming into the congregation and it being the fuel in which the church continues to grow. Maybe not numerically at first, although I really think that will happen. But we shouldn't enter into this or think about this with the idea that, hey, we've got to somehow keep the doors of the church open, and so we need to do this so that young people will come in. Nope. This is not a church growth model. What this is we want young people to know and love and serve Jesus. And we love our young people. And so We want to do whatever it takes as a church body to love and care for young people. And with that attitude, then it's wide open. Then it's not about who gets the bigger slice. It's about how do we as a church body love and care for a group that is suffering, that is leaving church, that isn't engaging in their faith for whatever reason. And we can tell them all the reasons why they shouldn't do those things. But I'm not sure that does any good. Arguments usually aren't going to change people's minds. What changes their minds are just engaging in their lives and wanting to know more about them, to building relationships with them. So, if anything, here's what I want you to take away from this. As you continue to think about what it means as a church body to grow younger, and it's this, is that how am I engaging young people in this church? How are you, no matter what age you are, stage of life you're in, how are you getting to know young people in this church? Again, contrary to popular belief, young people do want to get to know you. But here's the catch. The catch is we can't look at them as problems to be solved, because they're not. They have things that they need to learn, yes. Don't we all? Are they inexperienced? Yes. The only time can give them that experience. But they're not problems to be solved. They're people to be loved, to have a relationship with, to encourage, to strengthen, to walk alongside. That's what I hope that you'll want to do and desire for. And so it begins with us. It begins with us. As adults, we need to be the ones to reach out to the young people. Young people aren't going to do that automatically, right? So it's up to us as adults to reach out to them and say, hey, we're glad that you're here. We love you. I'd love to get to know you a little bit better. That's scary. I know. It's scary. But yet, they need it. They need it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in my sermon of why they need it. But they do need it. They need you to invest in their lives. They need you. No matter how little you think you have to offer to young people, you're wrong. You have a lot to offer. And they need you to invest in them. Love to open up for any questions the last few minutes that we have. Yes, ma'am.
Are you familiar with the program Saturate USA?
Sanctuary USA? Saturate USA? I am not.
It is a program that Greater Gaston Baptist Association has adopted.
Uh-huh.
And it is going out and, well, first of all, Saturate USA has volunteers. And they ship them to us if we choose. And it's going out and putting bags of things and maybe the church has some
Sure.
on doorknobs. And it's not just for financially challenged persons, it's for the whole community.
Right.
And I think there's about 11,000 people in that hall. And not put you on the spot, what do you think of that approach?
I think anytime we're out in the community, it's good. So I'll start from there. That may not, to me, that may not be the best approach in terms of getting to know people, because that doesn't really build relationships, right? Unless you actually get to speak to someone in the home. Yeah. Is that if you're just leaving something for them, it's, I mean, it'll never hurt, but yet it's not as effective as it could be. So that's, but not knowing all the specifics about that, that's kind of how I would initially look at that. Other questions, thoughts? Specific reasons, yes. So they drop out typically because they don't have the depth of relationships that will continue to encourage them. It's easy to say, oh, I'll find a church next week, and then the next week, and then the next week. And so when there's not a church family that would encourage them and say, hey, we love you, we continue to care for you, we contact you, there's not people in their lives that are saying, hey, have you found a Christian friend? Have you found a Christian organization on campus? Have you found a church wherever you are? That's the constant or consistent relationship that they need in their lives, and most of them don't have that.
But I heard you say that after they leave the youth group, they have that connection.
Right. Yep. There's not, so if they don't know you all, right? They don't have a relationship with you all. And when I say relationship, here's kind of what I mean. The depth of relationship is really important. Not just know their names and kind of where they go to school and what they like to do every once in a while, or what sport they play, or what activity they're in. It's getting to know them well enough where they are willing to share their joys and their pains with you. Their joys and their pains. Because when young people are willing to share that, that means just one thing, is that they trust you. They trust you. And unfortunately, we are no longer living in a time where young people just automatically trust church adults. We as adults have to kind of earn that trust with them. And so we have to be the ones to go and develop those relationships. Be consistent and say, hey, glad you're here, love you. What can I pray for you? And so developing those types of relationship is vital. Right. Yeah, so if you didn't hear that, the church has lost its voice at times and isn't trusted. And so how do we gain the trust of the people outside the church in our community and not... Again, I think it just kind of goes back to being consistent and helping our people in the community to know that we love them and care for them. So whatever that looks like is how do we care for them and love them, and being consistent over time in that. It can't be just 1 or 2 times a year that we're out in the community. It's got to be just kind of the ethos or the DNA of the church to be in the community and say, yes, we love you, we care for you, our doors are open to you, but not in a pressuring way of, yeah, you know what I mean. One more question, and then we will take a break and prepare for worship. Anyone?
Isn't this a place where we should be on our knees asking the Lord what we should do? And not just as a group, but individually as well.
Yeah.
And when our leaders make an avenue for us, that it would be God's will.
Yeah, absolutely.
Isn't that correct?
It always starts with that Jesus-centered community, and that certainly is where focus on prayer, focus on discernment, focus on community together as the body of Christ, working together, yes, that's where it starts.
The other thing that occurs is that someone said, why are people leaving the church? I do believe that God could lead us to different people to connect
Mm-hmm.
with the church.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, we don't want to be a church that just focuses on a certain group of people, we want to be a church that's loving to all people. What Growing Young is really focused on is addressing the need for focus on young people, but that doesn't mean that we lose focus on everything else. So yes,
And one connects to the other.
absolutely, absolutely.
Wait for the leaders to lead us. We got to get up and be.
It's on us, every one of us. So thank you, and look forward to our time of worship together. All right.